All set.
Hey, again, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today for this presentation. I think this is another one we've been looking forward to for a bit. Mayor, if you would lead us off, please, if your introductory remarks you want to make.
Thank you, President Scott. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to present the RACE Commission's update. I want to thank Dr. Archie. He's done a phenomenal job of leading the team on this and getting and working with all of the departments to put together this plan. We worked with the County of Monroe. I believe this past week we have released the website for the RACE Commission. As you know, this is probably one of the largest things that dealing with racial disparities and equities that our community has faced, and the ability to overcome those today. And so we want to make sure that we continue to move the suggestions from the RACE Commission forward as expeditiously as possible. And so in this past year's budget submission, we had assigned $1 million. Dr. Archie has worked with not only in discussing with the County of Monroe, but also with our internal teams, what things that we can do to really equalize things on a racial equity basis. And today that presentation will be provided to you. I know that there has been another question on the $15 an hour for everyone across the board. This is something that Councilmember Melendez had reached out to me about, and I do have an answer on that as well, and we can answer that during the question and answer period. But I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Archie to do the presentation, and I will answer any questions that he may have regarding anything else after he is done. Dr. Archie.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, everyone. I appreciate you for joining us today and giving us your time to highlight some of the very critical work that we have been facilitating here within the city and in partnership with Monroe County. As outlined by the mayor, today I'm going to spend a good bit of time, sort of highlighting a brief agenda that we have. I will be very transparent and just to say that I'm going to possibly be moving at a pretty quick click just to make sure that we're able to get everything in. What I have done is I've put in benchmarks within the presentation to make sure that I am stopping and giving you as council members the opportunity to ask questions about the volumes of work that we have committed to and that has already begun to be implemented. I would be remiss for not thanking my counterparts within OMB today, as well as the county who have been just in step with me in ways that my gratitude must communicate how thankful I am for their efforts and their support. I must also give appreciation for the members of the city's internal RACE task force who have submitted recommendations for funding, requests for funding in an effort to actually implement the recommendations that are in the report. And so today I have asked many of those, if not all of them, to join us during this presentation to give you, our council members, the opportunities to ask questions directly regarding the budgeted funding requests that they have put forward in an effort to complete and implement the recommendations outlined by the RACE Commission. And so if no further ado, I will go ahead on and kind of get started if I could. And thank you very much, Mayor, and thank you very much, City Council. So as an abbreviated agenda, I want to make sure that I give a brief overview of the 3-phase RACE implementation plan. As I said, it's a brief overview because the actual implementation plan itself has been communicated in multiple avenues throughout the last 2.5, 3 months. And so for most of you, if not all of you, this will only be just a reminder or a brief refresher. I'll talk about the city's phase 1 updates and where we are sort of to date, which will include my opportunity to outline and provide some thoughts and some feedback on how we have allocated that $1 million that was referenced by the mayor, talking about our procedures and processes in place, as well as what our next steps are for those specific budget proposals. I then will talk about the city's phase 2 updates, which is very instrumental and critical to City Council, as the phase 2 component of the work that's been outlined by both the city and the county requires that we engage with our critical city and county affiliates, such as City Council, such as RCSD, such as county legislator, to make sure that we are actually confirming that we are engaging you for areas reflected directly in the RACE report that have recommendations that are owned or recommended or suggested for your leadership. And so a core component of today's presentation will be me providing feedback or updates to City Council on the review that we've done so far in the city, where we've highlighted specific requests that will require your partnership and leadership. Finally, we'll talk about the City Council race, as I said, the RACE report recommendations, as well as finalize the opportunity to walk you through our current ROC RACE website, which has been redone as of late, and we want to provide you how that will be an instrumental component for communicating reports, updates, benchmarks of where we go forward. And so moving directly into the RACE reports implementation structure, as highlighted a moment ago, it is a 3-phased sort of implementation plan. And so phase 1 of that plan required that we as the city, because I'm going to be able today to speak specifically on the position of the actions of the city, because I want to make sure that as City Council, you are clear on what steps are being pushed forward with respect to the municipality you have direct correlation with. And so I want to make sure that I am giving you the city's specific steps that we are taking to move this work forward. But I'm going to focus more so today on phases 1 and phases 2, as those timelines are well underway, and we are moving those benchmarks that qualify what success would look like forward immediately. And so I just wanted to make sure that I referenced today that the primary focus will be on phases 1 and 2. So as stated during our prior communications efforts, as well as posted currently on the ROC RACE's webpage, this phase 1 principal review has specific outcomes that we're looking to have. And that's to make sure that the city, respectively, in partnership with the county, respectively, are both reviewing the entire RACE Commission's report to determine what areas of the report are independently as well as collaboratively owned by the 2 principals. And so this sort of first phase required that we do a deep dive into what the report's recommendations were, so that we could establish priorities as well as sequential steps that are necessary to the fulfillment of the things that it documents. It's important for us to make sure that we are being very thorough in our assessment to make sure that we are not skipping anything that may be critical to the community and our commitment to demonstrate the value of what this work was to be about. And so I won't really go too much into this, because this is the information that has been shared prior, and it's just a brief overview. The second phase, phase 2, which is our community leadership phase. This phase highlights our commitment to making sure that we as the principals are actually creating room and space and inviting the community to be a part of the RACE report's sort of guidance, its infrastructure, as well as its implementation. And so as stated during sort of the opening remarks about our agenda, this is the area that we have just completed. And as a part of this phase, it required that we engage our community stakeholders and our community affiliates that are directly connected to the city and the county, although they may not be embedded within the respective municipality structures. And so this is where I want to talk a little bit about today, about our next steps and how we're engaging you, as well as our other RCSDs and our other governing structures throughout the city and the county, to really help streamline our efforts to really make some traction on what these recommendations could be. And then finally, the third phase would be the establishment and the development of an actual successor body of the RACE Commission itself, identified in the implementation page of the report. And I think I have it here next to me. I think that's pages 67 and 68, if I'm not mistaken, of the report, that highlights the specific requests of the commissioners who wrote the report that said this work must be carried on by an additional body beside our 2 principals that have the ability to give some feedback, to give some recommendations on implementation, as well as become a true body who supports the full attainment of what this report was established to be. And so what I want to do now is I want to move into the sort of report out component of today's sort of presentation, if I could briefly, because again, I know that this is only an hour and I want to make sure we're moving right along. So with this, in respect to the phase 1 outcome, so the city of Rochester back in, I think that was March at the beginning of April, established a city internal race task force. That task force membership was to directly align and correlate with the departments within the city in tandem with the commission working groups, such as there is a human services component of the report. And so we wanted to make sure that our areas within human services within the city were actually directly linked to reviewing the recommendations of that correlated sort of focus area. Just like there is an area specifically in the report, a working group that identifies as recommendations and looking into policing. So we wanted to make sure that RPD absolutely was reflected among this task force to immediately begin reviewing the recommendations that were put forward on how we could improve our racial equity and structural equity within our policing matters. And so the way that we identified what members would be reflected on this internal city race task force is specifically areas that align with the working group's subject matter that would be able to own these recommendations and take these recommendations forward. In reviewing of the task force that we have established, including personnel from NBD, from law, from Red Code, from the Department of Human Resource Management, to Department of Recreation and Human Services, to RPD, we were very deliberate with making sure that we reviewed our recommendations independently so that we could individually review sort of our areas of expertise to see what items we could immediately say, this is mine specifically, but also to see where there are opportunities for alignment across our internal city stakeholders to begin to partner to identify what specific recommendations we would be using. And what I want to do is to give you sort of a sneak peek of what's to come in this presentation, because of these specific recommendations that we've reviewed, 58 are specifically city-owned recommendations that we have actually reflected on the current RASE website that identifies what specific department, what specific area within the city is working on that specific recommendation. And so I look forward to sharing with you what that will look like. We also did a thorough deep dive assessment, if you would, of each recommendation. We wanted to make sure that we developed a model infrastructure or a model framework that required per recommendation. We wanted each of the internal city race task force members to review the recommendation to determine, is this something that we would have to consider new, or is this something that we already have in an existing form? Who are the essential partners that we as city internal race task force members will need to work alongside or to create room at our table in order to make this recommendation implementable for us here as a community? What's the time frame for every one of the recommendations that we've identified that are owned by the city that we say it will take? Would it be a 1 year short-term time frame? Would it be longer than a year, up to, I think it's 3 to 5 years? And then the last sort of benchmark that we really wanted to make sure is that if we are asking our city internal race task force members to go out and implement these recommendations, then what are the specific resources that they would need in order to do so? And so that's where the number 4 benchmark comes into play, which is the allocation of the $1 million implementation plan budget. And so in a very few moments, I'm going to actually highlight some of the review criteria around what we considered in making sure that we did our fidelity and that we were being equitable in the distribution of those funds that could really produce the greatest impact. And then as number 5, what I'm about to walk you through is a few of the summary recommendation updates that we have that provide you concrete data on what we have done up till to date in reference to attaining and implementing the RACE recommendations. And so what I spoke about a second ago was to sort of talk about the criteria that we used in order to distribute and allocate what the funding opportunities would be for the RACE implementation. And so one of the things that we did is we made sure that all of the requests that came in were specifically tied to RACE implementation recommendations, right? We wanted to make sure that we weren't using these funding opportunities for anything else that was outside of that very clear window of where is this explicitly defined as a RACE recommendation. What we also wanted to do is we recognize that the $1 million is a great opportunity to make some traction, but in the larger context of the multiple hundred recommendations that are there, we also are aware that the $1 million will certainly not cover the implementation of every recommendation within a 1 year's allocation. And so we actually worked with MBD. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Chris Wagner, for working alongside us to consider how the RACE report's recommendations also actually met the criteria established within ARPA funding allowances. And so that was critical to make sure that we did collectively. As a second recommendation, as the money that we are awarded for this year, with your support, City Council, and of the current mayor, we received that money for a 1-year term, right? It's very clear that this money is not guaranteed to be continued in every funding cycle going forward, every fiscal year. And so what we wanted to do is to make sure that we prioritized what are the actual recommendations that we can confirm through our assessment process we can get done within this 1 year. And how are we using this 1-year benchmark as a way to prioritize and sequence what our recommendations for funding will be this year and how they will build a successful platform for the next phase of recommendations that we tackle next. And so again, that was one of the criteria that we use in order to consider what funding allocations we would prioritize. And then thirdly, what we wanted to do is we actually met after we received each of the funding requests, we actually met with the city internal task force members to collect feedback. So as these are personnel within the city who are owners of the specific recommendation and who probably possess the greatest experience and the knowledge around what it will take to do them, we wanted to make sure that we heard from them about, is this the recommendation that you would see would create the biggest impact in how we can attain all the recommendations? And should this be the first one? Should this be the second one? Are there multiple recommendations that you have that we could actually fold multiple recommendations into one funding request, so that if there were 4 to 5 different specific recommendations, and if we allocated money for one, could we actually embed other recommendations to be actually satisfied through the funding resources of that one? Again, just to confirm that we are using our resources to the best and most efficient avenues that we have them. And so to the right of this, I just highlighted some of the specific data that we asked for per our process for funding requests for and from each stakeholder. And so this is just a bird's eye view of what each of you as city council members received earlier this week that highlighted where the allocations or the recommendations for the $1 million budget respective to RACE report recommendations. As stated, the criteria that I just went over allowed us to really look at what these recommendations that were specifically tied to the RACE report, where they were, and how we could use these as a platform to build upon going forward. I want to echo that, again, there are other recommendations that you may not see here that have funding, and that's because some of those recommendations did qualify for allowance under possible other funding sources, CDBG, ARPA funds, that we actually had external resources outside of this $1 million budget that we could use to actually still support the outcome and attainment of those recommendations. One of the things that I wanted to talk about at the bottom of this slide here, which I'm certain you also noted when you received the actual draft of this on Monday, is that we recognize that City Council actually has recommendations as well as an organization, as an independent body. And so one of the things that we wanted to confirm that we did is we earmarked resources for those things that are specifically owned by City Council, so that even if it's not an amount in totality, because you may or may not have done the assessment yet to determine what your financial or funding needs are to obtain your implementation records, your recommendations, we wanted to at least to consider you during our process to confirm that we actually had money allocated, even if it's a small amount that we can continue to build toward. And so on pages 57 to 67 of the actual RACE report, as many of you know, there are the RACE summary recommendations. These summary recommendations are the totality of all of the working groups that I've listed. And what we found is that there were common themes, overarching cross-cutting themes that were clear that needed to be addressed throughout the race report collectively. And so what I'm going to go through it over these next couple of slides is to just give you a few of the highlights of the efforts that the city of Rochester specifically has already put traction behind, put funding behind. Some of these things are actually already completed. And so this is just to provide you a small glimpse of the work that the Department of Human Resource Management and DRHS and the Law Department, all of these areas that are reflected under the city's internal race task force have put forth already in attaining these recommendations. And so what we've done is we've broken it down so that you could specifically see of the current budgets that we have, whether it's ARPA funding or whether it's RACE funding, what monies have already been allocated towards specific items so that we are beginning to implement these things immediately. I want to be clear, there are some recommendations that are within the RACE report that do not require funding. And so what I did not want to do is to misrepresent the context of this conversation and say only the items that we are focusing on are those that have a financial context added to them, because that's actually not the case. But what this does is this also commits and shows that we are deliberate about using our funding sources to confirm that we are putting things in place that will strategically respond to the items that are represented within RACE. And so here within this first slide, it responds to the sort of RACE summary recommendations of number 1 and number 2, where you are able to review the current slide to see a few of the highlights from our compliance consultant that Constance Jefferson, our purchasing agent, is working with, which actually responds to multiple of the actual recommendations of the report, as well as our additional ARPA funding for those goals for both 1 and 2. For the sake of time, I want to move forward because I want to give you the more opportunity to ask questions during this time so that we can spend a little bit of time getting some feedback from you. Moving into the third sort of summary goal, as stated, the RACE funding is there. As you see, one of the things that's highlighted amongst the current RACE funding is that the Department of Human Resource Management, actually Tassie, was really vocal about saying she valued that make civil service test free for all. And so that was one of the core requests that DHRM said, if we're really going to talk about equity, which will lead us into removing an access barrier for people to take an exam that would increase their ability and their qualifications to get hired as people of color, then we really have to put the resources forward to do that. And so that's one of the many recommendations that are here. Again, as I noted earlier, staying with the RACE summary recommendation number 3 is that working with RPD, there was one of the recommendations of the report said to end the zero tolerance policing. And that didn't necessarily require thousands of dollars or a funding request to do it, but the chief of police did it. And so those are some of the things that are already done that I wanted to at least communicate where we were today and how we were moving forward with some of these operations. Goal 4, or summary recommendation 4 of the 5, highlights a similar infrastructure of how are we moving together with bringing together DHRS as human services subjects, human services areas are reflected amongst the city and the county. How are we using the recommendation of the report? I think, and I was so pleased at Dr. Lyman Torres's recommendation, because she said, Dr. Archie, from I think it's 4A to 4I of the summary recommendation for this one funding request actually satisfies every one of those recommendations. And that's where we wanted to really use our efforts to say what funding streams or sources really can have the largest impact on the work that we're trying to do. And so in addition to that, there's all the additional ARPA funding requests that are put forward as well that directly correlate to the things that are benchmarked and identified under the RACE report recommendations. And then finally, there is this number 5, embed accountability measures, right? Where we're talking about Ruby, we're talking about developing an evaluations program with external consultants who would come in and say, for every one of the areas in the report where the city has stated, oh, we're already doing this already exists. We're going to have consultants sort of do program evaluations to say, how is it that we are not as effective as it could be, and what can we do to improve that? And they are affiliated with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which is a national high impact practice organization who does this specific work that they're doing for us potentially going forward on a national level. And so again, just making sure that we're bringing forth people who have the expertise, the knowledge, and the background to be able to help facilitate the success in partnership with the people who are among our community. And so with this, I think I've given you a good bit of information, and I don't want to overload you, and I want to keep track of time because this is really good work. I want to see if at this time City Council has any specific questions that they would like to ask, and I'll take off the PowerPoint to be able to hear any thoughts, any questions before we go into this second sort of component of the presentation, which will specifically highlight the request owned by City Council reflected in the Race Commission's report. So as of this point, I will yield, and I will open up the floor to any questions that are being put forward with where we are and any of the information provided thus far.
Councilmember Melendez.
Okay.
Did you have a question on pose?
Yes, I have one question, just related to the construction in disadvantaged zip codes, incentivizing that. How does $50,000 help us in that regard? What does that actually buy us, and what would the focus be?
So if we're pulling up the recommendation, I'm going to pull it back up so that I can see it. The $50,000 was for, I think that was for, Constance, are you on the call?
Have input on that. Okay, so the $50,000, of course, is not going to be all we need in terms of incentive money. One of the things is that the city had an incentive program in place prior to this, that the funds were not really being used. And after researching it and trying to determine why, people were not taking advantage of this, is that it was determined that we had focused it on the wrong group of people. We had focused it on huge prime contractors instead of focusing it and narrowing it down to provide opportunities for small and mid-sized businesses to take advantage of getting contract opportunities with the city. And we also, it is also embedded in the apprenticeship programs. And so with us changing the legislation for apprenticeship programs to increase the opportunities for small and mid-sized businesses to now have opportunities to contract with the city as a prime contractor, we felt as though we needed to offer some incentives, and we're taking the rest of the money that is in our incentive programs from before, and we're rolling it into this money so that we will be able to, over the next year, look and see how much more use of this program we can get. And we also will open up opportunities to increase workforce diversity, which was one of the main issues within the race report as well.
Great, thank you. And a second question is just, I know that we said today we'll be focused on the city and the city recommendations, but I'd love to hear, as we get further into implementation, how the city and the county and other parts of government, we don't have to answer all of that now, but if you can give us a sense of how the collaboration is going and how we can continue to support more cross collaboration between the city and the county.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. It is going to be responded to in the presentation, but I appreciate the question.
I do want to note that Dr. Candace Lucas is on the line from the county as well, who is Dr. Archie's counterpart that has been working with him on a race commission. And so, they have been great partners working together to get this work done. And we want to acknowledge the fact that she's here and thank her for her leadership and support on this project.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor. Thank you for the question, Councilman Melendez. And as Dr. Archie said, we have been working in concert on this, and it will be addressed further on in the conversation as well.
Vice President Lightfoot.
Good afternoon, everyone, to the president, to esteemed mayor, and to all of my colleagues, and to you, Dr. Archie, and Dr. Candace Lucas. Thank you for this work. As one of the members of the Race Commission, it is my passion to see this work move into implementation phase. In one of our recent meetings, I did reference the fact of being able to use ARPA funding for things of like the fire department, et cetera. And I remember that I believe it was said that that was going to be looked into. I do see that it's in your report. So when you look at RACE summary recommendations, in number 2, it says ARPA funding firehouse facility renovations to accommodate workforce diversity. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because before I wasn't really quite sure if that money could be utilized. I referenced the capital improvement project. I just want to get a little bit of specifics about the direction of that, please. Thank you.
Sure. I would yield to Sarah from OMB, who was on the call, because I could respond, but I want the person who specifically helped facilitate that to speak to it. And so I'll yield to Sarah.
Thank you, Dr. Archie. Hello, everybody. Yeah, so that is still on our ARPA list. It is in the spending plan that we shared a couple of weeks ago. And I don't know that there's any news to report on that issue, except that we do believe it will be eligible under ARPA as part of the revenue recovery portion of the eligibility for the ARPA grant funds.
I can talk a little bit about one of the challenges that's going on in the firehouses. We have more women that have come on to the fire force, and the bathrooms needed to be upgraded. There are some, at one point in time, as you know, Vice President Lightfoot, firehouses only had men, and we have a diverse group of candidates that are a part of our fire department, and we will need to make some changes and some upgrades. This was one thing that was put forth by our fire chief to make sure that we consider. And I know that also one of the things that you wanted to look at, and I'm sure that the next administration will probably look at, is combination of building a new firehouse and probably combining. But we know that our neighborhoods are very much attuned and married to their firehouse. And so that will be something that will have to be discussed in the future. But we want to make it known that this is a priority, and should be a priority, that we make sure that the facilities are conducive to the people that are actually working in our firehouses, and we have more women working there now than we had in the past.
I think it's also important to add, before we move on from that point, that in order for us to really materialize what we say this report is about, that we can't wait until members of the community are already at the facility. We have to plan for their success and meeting their needs before they even arrive. And so a part of the commitment to establish these facility modifications is for that purpose. So we have employees of multiple genders that are working in fire departments, but if we want to confirm that we're able to continue to recruit members of these communities, then we have to continue to put forth these efforts in their considerations of what they will need to be comfortable before they even get there. And so that is absolutely in alignment with what your question or your recommendation was, Vice President Lightfoot. And I just want to acknowledge that and tell you thank you.
I have a question, President Scott. Oh, sorry.
Dr. Lucas, recognizing this is a city presentation, but I was just curious about work related to addressing generational poverty in terms of county welfare recipients. Was there anything that we've done so far that sort of gets to that? Whether it's the way we structured the family allocations, or was there any looking at that?
Thanks, President Scott. So yes, there were a number of recommendations around our Social and Human Services Department, and we are currently going through a strategic plan looking at how we can restructure that department, decentralize the services, and ensure that we are meeting people where they are. That project is going to be starting within the next few months. We have engaged with consultants on that. We'll be hiring some staff, and we're working with systems integration. We'll be engaging community voice throughout that process as well, to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the community that we are trying to serve. We anticipate this taking a few years to make sure that we do it correctly. But it is something that we saw in the recommendations. We have known about these issues for some time, and we're taking it very seriously and wanting to be deliberative in how we move that forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Councilmember Gruber.
Thank you. Dr. Archie, would you mind pulling up the presentation again and just going to the one slide that lists the $1 million allocation, which I know you sent to all the council. I appreciate it. I just want to ask you a couple questions about it.
Sure.
Thanks. So first of all, I guess I just want to make sure, maybe I'm missing it on here, but is there anything related to like the timeline? I mean, obviously this $1 million is for fiscal year 22. So we're, quarter the way through. I presume all of these are intended to come to council to review by June, but does each thing have a specific timeline attached to it?
So to your point, so we talked about, I think it's here. Yes. So under this initial assessment form, for every one of the recommendations that we actually considered as priority, one of the core criteria is actually confirming that these were things that we felt could be done within the 1 year timeframe. And so that was one of the, I think is this next slide that talks about it as well. Yes, so per the assessment phase of every one of the reviews, we required that as they collected and said, these are all the recommendations owned by HR. And of these recommendations owned by HR, what is the time frame that we in HR say it will take us to complete these things? And so we took their actual assessment of how long it will take them to facilitate it. And that was actually one of the core criteria for prioritized funding our budget request that you see in this spreadsheet. So yes.
Got it. So like, for example, the top one, the Quali software, I know we already voted on that in July. It passed and that's great that we have some traction there. But for the rest of them, I don't believe we've seen any others to this point. Should we expect to see them all in the next couple of months, or will it all be kind of spread out over the next 8 months, as it were?
Well, I know Sarah's on the call, and I committed to allowing her to talk about the next steps of these requests. I think that all of us wanted to make sure that, again, when you're working in partnership, that we are communicating even what the request and the proposed funding allocations would be. And we wanted to make sure that City Council was absolutely a part of knowing what those requests were and in giving you the opportunity to say, okay, we acknowledge it. So with having said that, I will yield to Sarah to talk about the specific next steps.
Thank you, Dr. Archie. Yeah, I would say these will be either spent or encumbered by June. In some cases, we might be encumbering a contract in the spring. So, some of these monies could carry forward into the next year. I don't know that we ended up having any staff in any of these. Oh, we do have a couple of staff. So that's another situation where if it doesn't all get spent in the current year, we could assign monies in fiscal 23 to get a full year of expenditures in.
Thanks, sir. Actually, that's a great segue to my sorry, President Scott, my last question. But the second to last bullet on the left side of the chart. So it's revising local government job posting requirements, which I think is critically important, and I'm glad that's a place where we're prioritizing. But needless to say, $100,000 for that. I presume a lot of that is about staff time and having people who are dedicated to doing this work. But how would we get a sense for what the actual expenditures are in a line item like that?
Sure, and that's a good point. And I actually will introduce it, but I will let Director Demps be able to respond directly to it. But what I did appreciate about your question is that this is one of the areas that I talked about where there is actually more than one recommendation being satisfied per that one request. So I know that there was an opportunity to revise local job government postings, but there were also 2 additional two additional sort of recommendations that actually tie to that very same request, so that as the staffing and the personnel who are going to be reviewing that job description, they're also going to be doing two other things with that very same scope of work that align. And so, but I know that explicitly was one of the recommendations that Director Demps brought forward that we acknowledged could actually satisfy multiple recommendations. But I lean into yielding to Director Demps to allow her to respond directly.
Councilman Gruber, yes, some of this work, we had started this work in HR, but by getting this funding, you're absolutely correct. It allows us to look at bringing on staff support. There are over 800 job specs, and we need dedicated staff so we can get this done, get it done within a year's time frame, and be able to move in a direction that would allow us to work collaboratively with departments. So this would be one of those initiatives that would require additional staff to help support the initiative so we can get it done in the time frame of the 1 year, if not less than 1 year.
Got it. Thank you. I guess the last thing I would just say about this, and I'll close it there. For something like that, you know, I have some questions arise. Like, are these contract workers, people who are going to come in to do a specific project and then it's going to be over? Or are these new members of Human Services? Because obviously, when it comes to any major budget mods, and as usual, there's kind of two sides to a huge amount of money that we're getting in terms of ARPA, et cetera, that we don't want to staff up departments that we aren't going to be able to sustain in the long term. So just want some type of clarity on that when the opportunity arises.
We haven't made that final decision, but we are looking at taking into consideration that this is a 1 year initiative. So you wouldn't want to incur costs that would go past that. So we could possibly say, for instance, bring in 2 temporary people. They can work for 1 year and be able to get this done, or it may be a consultant. We haven't decided that, but we certainly would be taking into consideration that we don't want to incur costs that would have to be carried over. It would be something that would allow us to be able to successfully achieve this project in the 1 year timeframe.
Thank you.
I just want to add to that, you know, the question previously that Sarah was answering, Councilmember Gruber, there may be legislation that may come to you for RASE prior to 2022, because it is a 21-22 budget. I know that Constance was working on something in finance, and so that may be coming possibly in December. I haven't seen it for November, but it may be coming possibly in December, so that you know that.
Thank you.
So if there are no more immediate questions, because I want to make sure I get to the crux of, because I know it's 5:16 and I want to make sure that I get to specific things that I want to confirm with.
Let's move on.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam President, for the opportunity to do so. So this next sort of phase 2 discussion, as spoken briefly about with Dr. Lucas, is that we've done a relaunch of the RASE website, which actually allows you to see the confirmed owned recommendations by the 2 principals. As stated a moment ago, it identifies what the recommendation is. It identifies who the principal is that will be responding to it, as well as even funnels that down even more so into the specific department that is reflected under the principal and their actions to next steps forward. And so we'll be able to document that and, if time permits, actually show it on the screen in a few moments. The second thing that Dr. Lucas and I have been prioritizing as far as the phase 2 community leadership component is also recognizing that there are areas, as I think one of our council persons stated as well, that are absolutely co-owned by the city and the county. And so this is where our commitment to being inclusive and collaborative around this report will require that we actually begin to convene the city and the county collectively around certain recommendations that are owned by them both. And so this is the sort of next step phases that we're looking into. The third component of this phase 2 is to talk about the identification and engagement of our affiliated stakeholders, such as City Council today, and making sure that we are working in tandem with you to say we want to support your efforts to actually work and implement these recommendations as well. And then finally, what's really, really exciting, an opportunity that's probably going to be released to the media and to communicate it out to the community this week, is the opportunity for community members and community organizations to notify the principals of these are the recommendations that we are currently working on in the RACE report. These are the recommendations that we would like to partner with other organizations to work on, to make sure that we are truly embodying the spirit of what this report was to be about, which is to create room for our community leaders, our community partners, our CBOs, our GRE organizations, all of the organizations that are out there in the community who absolutely are critical to the sustainability of what this work is to be. And so we've created an opportunity on the RACE webpage now where you can go and identify yourself as an organization, as a community member, as a company, as a business, and say, these are the things that we have committed to and what we're working on. And the reason why that's so important is because it also helps us to commit to breaking down these silos. So to have 20 organizations all working on the exact same recommendation, but nobody is aware that any of the other 19 is working on the same resources, truly creates opportunities for breakdown in what this was supposed to be about. And so this infrastructure allows you to see, because as you notify us who's doing what and what you would like to do, we absolutely post that on the website so that you are critically aware of who's doing what, but also give you the opportunity to get and engage with them versus building a separate silo that may not be as effective as it could be due to collaborative efforts. And so with this, moving forward from here, my computer would respond, I actually want to run through some specific recommendations that are outlined within the RACE report that are supposed to be led by City Council. And so as the city's commitment to make sure that we are working with City Council to support you, not only in allocating or earmarking funds to say, what is it that you need, but it's also our job to make sure that you are aware of the specific requests. I give that with the caveat of communicating to you that although these are the next 6 to 7 recommendations that are explicitly owned by City Council, your impact and your need is so much greater than these simple 6 that you are about to learn about. I literally read every one of the law department's recommendations, and every one of them requires, obviously, the leadership of City Council. And so your work is so essential to more than just these 7. And I just really want to impress upon you the value of your partnership. I know that within Department of Human Resource Management, one of the recommendations is that the director of HR be committed to, petitioning the state on changes that are critically needed to the civil service process. And as much as, I'm confident that Director Depps can make an impact, it is not comparable to when the city, as the City Council, gets behind those efforts to say, how are we advocating for some of these things as well? And so I don't want to misrepresent and say that these recommendations that I'm about to go over with you are the only ones, because your impact and your support are going to be vital going forward, exponentially beyond just these. But if I could, what I've done here is that, and I'll be more than glad to share these things with you, is that I went through the entire RACE report and documented any place and the specific working group, the page number, the specific issue, and the report recommendation that is specifically asking your leadership. And so what I want to do is to just briefly go through these to make sure that you are aware of some of the context of what these things are, so that we could begin partnering with you to see how we can help you to actually implement and follow through with these recommendations. So the first one was the education working group on page 115, and it was an issue around funding. And the actual verbatim recommendation was that City Council to advocate to change state policy to allow residents to vote on school budgets. And so that may seem like a very small sentence, but the amount of work that it would take to truly take that on and potential resources is going to be really vital for us to consider to really make that happen. The second recommendation was provided to City Council was under our healthcare working group on page 121. And the issue was looking at government systems and infrastructure. It said the work group noted from the beginning of our process that neither the city nor the county have a health committee in their legislatures. So looking at city council and county leg. And it says the recommendation is to establish a standing health committee in the Rochester City Council with a charge that includes eliminating health disparities for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The next recommendation also came from healthcare, printed on page 124, and it focused on access and affordability of healthcare to increase racial health. And the recommendation is as follows: endorse and engage in intergovernmental advocacy for passage of the New York Health Act to provide comprehensive universal health coverage for every New Yorker. The next recommendation 4 also came from Working Group Healthcare, and it was on page 131, and it talked about anti-racist, respectful, integrated, and quality care. Specifically, it cited amend section 63 of city charter to prohibit discrimination, including racial discrimination in healthcare. The next recommendation also, again, comes from healthcare. We're printed on page 133, talks about anti-racist training and leadership. It cites amend part 2, section 28 of the city charter to mandate training of licensed ambulance operators and other first responders on racism, implicit bias, and cultural linguistic competency tied to their job roles in emergency response, including the communication with deaf and hard of hearing residents and community members. 6, moved over to our housing working group, and this was on pages 142 and 143, and it focused on housing affordability. It said, explore the feasibility of a tenant opportunity to purchase law in Rochester. This type of program would provide an opportunity for rental tenants, qualified housing nonprofits, or some combination to assemble funds to purchase a rental property as an owner offers it for sale. And I think this is our final recommendation. This was just for job creation on page 180. It said the issue was that there are no state or local pay transparency laws or requirements. And what they're asking City Council to do is to advocate for passage of a state level pay transparency law as the first recommendation. And then in conjunction to that, they ask that we examine what ordinances, regulations, or policies supporting pay transparency can be enacted by our local government. So as stated, these are some of the specific opportunities that were identified as City Council specific, that named verbatim in the report, that I wanted to make sure that I came to the table and formally communicated was identified as owned by your area. I know that we now have only a few minutes, literally 4 minutes of time. So I'm not going to unfortunately be able to pull up the website to go through it, because I do want to offer you, at least in these last few minutes, some opportunities to provide any closing comments, any closing questions that you may have regarding the second sort of phase of what we just talked about, which is more focused on those next step efforts, engaging the community, developing platforms for the community to get involved, to become owners of specific recommendations, as well as highlighting your respective critically and vitally needed support and ownership of recommendations identified within the RACE report. And so if there are any questions, Madam President, I yield to you to facilitate that conversation, but thank you.
We were going to lift up the issue of increasing the minimum wage for all.
Certainly. I will yield to Madam Mayor for that. She has the most recent updates.
Yes, Madam President. I had a discussion with Councilmember Melendez a couple of weeks ago, wanting to do this as soon as possible. And I had the budget director and HR director go and look at how this could happen. And so we could pass a resolution, but it's not necessary that, we can do a joint resolution from administration and city council, increasing the $15 minimum wage across the board for all city employees. According to budget, it will be approximately $284,000 to do that. It may come in a little bit lower. We recommend, or budget recommends, that we do this and amend the current budget. We won't have to amend the current budget, I'm sorry. but that this would start on January 1st. And the reason why they're recommending that this start on January 1st is because there are some compression issues, and there will be some, there is a title that we would have to negotiate some changes in with the union. And so this would basically be the increase starting January 1st. Our belief is that that the increased minimum wage will create some compression issues with other titles that will need to be addressed in upcoming budgets, and will likely put pressure on wages for contract negotiations with our unions, particularly ASME going forward. But you know, we don't believe that there will be any problem with the source of the funds. But if you want to, we can bring forth joint legislation now to increase that minimum wage across the board for all employees on January 1. And I do believe that that is when the county is starting theirs as well.
Excellent. We raised this in the budget review, and I think we even got information about what it would cost. I recall $377,000 as the number that was given to us at that time. I mean, I'm glad to hear it's lower, but it was much higher.
We're talking about 6 months instead of an entire year. So it would be 6 months from January, in this budget, from January 1st to June 30th. And then the next administration would need to continue that going forward. So I think that that's a reduction in the cost. And then also there was a change in the number of employees that we've had. And so that may be accounting for it as well. Unfortunately, Chris Wagner isn't here. I don't know if Sarah knows the answer to, you know, additional information on that, but according to what I have from Chris, he believes that it will be approximately $284,000 if we start on January 1, and this is a conservative number.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about it. So that's right. That's about a half a year. If we did that based on a full year of the current fiscal year, fiscal 22, and of course, most, you know, a lot of the part-time and seasonal wages are in the summer. So that July through December period tends to be a higher cost period for those titles than January through June. So that's why the mayor's saying it is a conservative estimate for the current year. The number we gave you before, at that time, we decided to use fiscal 21 projected hours. And of course, fiscal 21 was highly impacted by COVID. Yeah, so a lot of the part-time and seasonal, yeah. So you can understand how that was a lower number because schools weren't in session. So the school traffic officers didn't really factor in, et cetera.
And President Scott, if I may, I would just like to confirm the mayor's statement that is when the county will begin as well on January 1st for all county employees and contractors.
Madam President, can I jump in here?
Please do.
I just want to say thank you to the administration, OMB, everyone who's had a hand in looking at this. This really is an important goal for many in the community. You know, part-time and seasonal workers are often Black and brown folks in our communities that are starting up, you know, doing some of the heavy lifting in our neighborhoods. And I think also that this is an important move for our MAPI, the anti-poverty initiative. They really are focused on trying to lift wages in the region. So thank you all for looking at this. And I certainly would support a move to try to get this done.
Yeah, I think it's very important, both theoretically and practically speaking, because from a competitive stance, we need to do it. McDonald's starts at $15 an hour. You know, many of the service organizations do. So we definitely need to step up with that. Additional questions, comments? If there are none, I believe that we've completed our business and will therefore adjourn. Again, I'd like to thank you all for joining me. Thank you very much for the presentation and have a great evening.
Thank you, City Council.
Thank you all.